The Democratic Socialist candidate Zohran Mamdani wins the New York City mayor's race. The right goes into a complete meltdown about live streamer Nick Fuentes. And Dick Cheney, the architect of America's foreign wars over the last quarter century, has died, raising questions about his legacy and where America goes next. All this and more on the very first episode of our new podcast with blazetv, Rufo and Lomez. So, Lomez, we're launching this podcast in the middle of a right-wing meltdown and in the middle of an off-year election where everyone is scrambling to figure out what to make of things. And how are you holding up in this fraught psychological time?
Yeah, it's interesting. Welcome, viewers, by the way. We are recording this on Wednesday, November 5th. I think it's November 5th. I think, Chris, normally we're going to be recording on Thursdays. This is an exception. I have to travel tomorrow. So this will come out Friday. We just had the election. I think, yes, we are in this moment of seems like intra-party spasm and things are kind of settling out, and there's some lack of clarity where things go, not just over the next few years for the remainder of the Trump term, but then importantly, what's going to come after. And I think a lot of what we're seeing is a kind of jockeying for position for the post-Trump era. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then also, not much is happening. And when things aren't happening, or things are just kind of, trudging along as they often do, that tends to be where the psychodrama starts. People start to create spectacle out of their own psychology rather than what's actually happening in the world. So I don't want to discount the idea that the mayoral election in New York is important. Of course it's important. It's the biggest city, not just in the country, but it's kind of the imperial seat in some sense. So that's very important. But yeah, off-year elections in Virginia, California, New York, all blue states, New Jersey too. So all blue states. How important is this? Okay, but then I have to say maybe this is just cope, because things didn't go very well last night for the right. It wasn't a great night for Republicans, and maybe we are just coping to say that this isn't very important. I don't know. Do you think this is important?
Yeah, no, I think this is a nothing happened moment that we're reading too far into. Look, Kamala Harris won New Jersey. Kamala Harris won Virginia by 8 points. And so the idea that these are swing states, that these were closely contested elections, that Republicans, had a voter surge at the end and could win it, I think was always somewhat of an illusion. The fact is that Kamala Harris was a terrible candidate. And even though Trump won all the swing states last year, Kamala Harris won these states decisively. The margin increased in both Virginia and New Jersey, but that's also part of a natural thermostatic reaction. When one party comes into power, Trump has Congress, Trump has the White House, there's always a natural kind of balance back. We saw that in 2021. We're seeing it again in 2025. These are part of the natural cycle of things. I think this was baked in. I think this is exactly what we should have expected. The one interesting race, though, is the New York City mayoral race. This was an idiosyncratic thing, right? You have Zohran Mamdani, you have Andrew Cuomo, you have, the beautifully bereaved Curtis Sliwa. It's kind of a rogues gallery of candidates, all of whom have enormous flaws. And my read of it is that Mamdani had the most sophisticated campaign. He was the most charismatic candidate. He didn't have the baggage of the other two candidates, namely kind of Cuomo as a relic of the past, Sliwa as a conservative, Republican, oddball. Yeah. And so he was able to get that magical 50% in the election. And I think it's really interesting to analyze it, not as a kind of horse race phenomenon, but try to figure out, what is Mamdani symbolic of? He is something new in our politics. And kind of what were your first thoughts as you watched him rise and now clinch the victory?
Okay. Again, maybe I'm like in cope mode because I don't want this to be important, but it's like not terribly surprising. And I think Mamdani, while I don't like him at all, this isn't sort of catastrophic. Like if I'm looking for the sort of policy daylight between what he might do in New York City versus de Blasio, I think it's like pretty thin. Like I think Mamdani will go a little further and will certainly go a lot further in terms of his rhetoric. So I think like I don't want to over-index the fact that Mamdani won and won pretty significantly. Like you said, the other candidates were deeply flawed. It was like this weird race with three other potential candidates. Don't forget Eric Adams in there. And Eric Adams was weirdly the sort of most Trumpian candidate of all of them. I mean, a lot of his rhetoric towards the end, like before he dropped out, he was most sort of sympathetic towards ICE and deportations, and he was going to follow through on a lot of the immigration stuff. The other candidates sort of waffled on those questions. Sliwa has like a long history of, opposition to Trump in particular. They're like these two sort of flamboyant New York characters who have this sort of personality feud. So Sliwa couldn't get all the way behind Trump, and Trump, of course, couldn't endorse Sliwa. He ends up endorsing Cuomo, who's this like horrible candidate, because of what he did during COVID and just kind of like boilerplate, run of the mill, time has passed him by kind of boomer lib. So Mamdani was kind of in a perfect situation. Do I think Zohran Mamdani is going to impose a kind of like communist authoritarianism on New York City? No, I don't. I think things will just kind of get incrementally worse in ways that aren't good. I think, letting people out of jails is going to be bad, and it's going to result in a lot of violence and unnecessary violence. And it's going to make just like day-to-day city living like just less appealing. It just makes the world a little bit less appealing to be in. And I don't know why anybody would want to do that other than because of the kind of sort of moral, signaling that and sort of status and pride that, libs can wallow in when they vote for someone like him. I think the key thing here, and I think this is important to say, is that Mamdani represents, above all else, a kind of post-Americanness, a post-white Americanness in particular. I think that's really important. There was a clip about from Mamdani getting passed around this morning. He's praising the Mexican abuelas and the Senegalese DoorDash drivers and so on and so forth. Not Mexican American, not Senegalese American, just those things without the hyphen at all. And I think that's important. I do also want to remind people that Zohran Mamdani made explicitly like anti-white statements during his campaign. He's talked about a sort of tax program that would explicitly tax wealthy white people, not just wealthy people, but wealthy white people. And I think that kind of normalization, which is something we've seen from the Democratic Party sort of escalating over the last decade, is the most important part of this. And it's the thing that gives me the most concern.
Yeah, I think there are two big stories about Mamdani's rise. One is about a demographic change, and the other is about an ideological change. And the demographics are really clear. If you ask, Grok, give me the ethnicity of all the mayors of New York City in the last 100 years, it's overwhelmingly Irish, Italian, and some Jewish mayors. And so that was a revolution. Originally, you had English, Dutch, you had the original kind of founding stock of New York running the city for its first part in history. The 20th century was really about the rise of white ethnics, Irish, Italian, and Jews. Like you can trade like jokes among each other. I feel like there's a certain coherence of the new white ethnics who came to dominate New York machine politics in particular. Yeah. And then this is the next thing. And if you look at the kind of demographic coalition of Mamdani, and especially if you look at the rhetorical arc of Mamdani's campaign, it's certainly about that. Although I would say this, it's important to not fall for the right-wing boomer bait to say that Mamdani is the Islamist candidate.
Yeah,
that he's going to bring Sharia law to New York City. That's not quite right. Of course, during the campaign, he did campaign openly with Islamists, including an unindicted co-conspirator of the World Trade Center bombing, whose son was arrested and prosecuted and convicted for trying to running like a terrorist training camp and recruiting school shooters. And so, like, yes, the unsavory characters around him. But if you look at Mamdani, and this is the second shift, the ideological shift, if you look at Mamdani's ideology, it's kind of an amalgam of all of these various left-wing ideological trends. He'll be, campaigning with Islamists, but then he'll also be tweeting that defund the police means queer liberation. He'll be hosting events with drag queens, promising a drag queen in every school. And then, he has these other incredible moments where he's seemingly endorsing an unreconstructed, pure theoretical Marxism. And one clip, and I want to get your critique not only on the ideology, but on the wardrobe and the set dressing of this clip, which I think is the perfect encapsulation of this kind of post-American, post-Western, kind of post-Marxist ideology. Let's listen to this clip from Zohran Mamdani.
What the purpose is about this entire project, it's not simply to raise class consciousness, but to win socialism. And obviously raising class consciousness is a critical part of that. But making sure that we have candidates that both understand that and are willing to put that forward at every which moment that they have, at every which opportunity that they're given. We have to continue to elect more socialists, and we have to ensure that we are unapologetic about our socialism. There are also other issues that we firmly believe in, whether it's BDS, right, or whether it's the end goal of seizing the means of production, where we do not have the same level of support at this very moment.
Yeah, as Norm Macdonald would say, that sounds like some commie gobbledygook. Okay, it's like standard boilerplate sort of new agey kind of socialist rhetoric. I don't find it all that concerning, really. I mean, again, like, we can sit here and go, oh my gosh, and lose our minds, like the communists are taking over New York City or something. I don't really think that's the case. I don't see a path towards implementing a project where Zohran Mamdani is leading his Mexican abuelas and Senegalese taxi drivers to seize the means of production. I don't even know what that would mean. Like, they go into BlackRock and like depose Larry Fink from, his offices, and somehow they're now in charge of this sort of massive, wealth of capital or something. I don't think so. Unfortunately, what this actually means, what this actually gets interpreted into in terms of action, is more stuff like Luigi Mangione, okay? Like the psychopaths who hear this and now think the action to take to instantiate these vague abstractions is to go enact political violence. And this, anytime you see a wave of sort of like communist politics in the United States, it rarely translates into something sort of like concrete. Maybe there's more robust union efforts or something, and you get like collective bargaining that is more union friendly. But what this generally means, like the most important thing this generally means, is they become violent. And that's something that we've been seeing, of course, over the last 6 months to a year. We saw, the other important thing where we haven't talked about the Virginia election yet, but we also saw this in like the text messages of Jay Jones, and this kind of tacit tolerance and acceptance of the fact that there's going to be a certain amount of communist, leftist inspired violence. And so that's the thing that scares me. It's not so much like what Mamdani's going to do in terms of seizing the means of production. It's more just the stochastic actions of these psychopaths on the fringes who are sort of desperate and have no other way to exercise personal agency in the world than to be violent.
Lomez, how do you take your whiskey? Are you more of a ice guy? You more of a neat guy? What's your go-to approach?
Yeah, 1 cube of ice. That's my jam now. I went away from whiskey and bourbon for a long time. It seemed like maybe over the last 10 years or so, drinking whiskey was this performative act, and every bottle had some unique feature on it, be wrapped in leather, or it was in some weird shape. And so I kind of turned away from bourbon. But I will say, Flying Ace is really good. It's simple. It's really clean. My wife likes it too. So we've gotten back into drinking whiskey. It's great. How about yourself?
Yeah, I gave up drinking many years ago, but I have had Flying Ace on my shelf. Guys that come over, want to have a drink, want to smoke a cigar, they love it. And I think that's exactly right. Whiskey has become so trendy and ridiculous and pretentious. Flying Ace is straight bourbon, exactly how it was supposed to be. Bold, balanced, unapologetically American, no gimmicks, no fluff. Just real whiskey made from people who love this country, have high standards, and are putting out a great product. And so I would encourage everybody to try Flying Ace whiskey, to order the bourbon, get it delivered to your house. It's available right now at flyingacespirits.com. And if you use the promo code BLAZE, you'll get free shipping. That's flyingacespirits.com, promo code BLAZE for free shipping. Yeah, and I think the fundamental difference and why the rhetoric to me rings so hollow, it's actually hard to watch because it's so obviously phony. It's an affect, it's a symbol, it's a highly educated, millennial or Gen Z stylistic utterance. It's not anything more. You can't imagine the kind of dirtbag leftists leaving a Democratic Socialists of America meeting in Brooklyn, and then, driving to Detroit, banging down the doors of the Ford plant, and then assembling F-150s.
Right.
They don't know how to do it. They wouldn't want to do it. It's not even a thing that they could even imagine in practical, concrete terms. And then when you're saying the means of production in New York City doesn't produce anything. Right. New York City is a postmodern, ephemeral economy. It's finance, it's insurance, it's media, it's law, it's, food service, et cetera, kind of the service class at the bottom. And so, if you go into BlackRock's office and you actually try to seize the capital, the CFO is going to put 2 clicks on his computer. All that capital is gone. It's digitally transferred somewhere else. You can shut the office and move. It's not actually that hard. While it's hard to move an automobile factory, it's very easy to move an office, especially in an era where big cities like down south, for example, have high vacancy rates. And so I think it's an empty threat that is more a cultural signal. But I think it's also something that we should take seriously. We shouldn't dismiss, because the truth is, these ideas did win the mayoralty of America's largest city. Yeah. And I think ultimately what he's trying to conjure up with that kind of global, universal image on the background of that clip, and then the kind of vaguely, African or kind of South Asian, shirt that he's wearing, is the image of third worldist liberation. And so Third Worldist liberation was this social and political movement in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America that peaked during the 1960s and 1970s, where you'd have communist, Marxist, guerrilla fighters funded by the Soviet Union, agitating against capitalism, against Yankee domination, against European domination. And they turned this kind of ethnic grievance, nationalist grievance, anti-imperialist grievance into some of these revolutions. And they were successful virtually everywhere over time in decolonizing. And I think that's really what he's talking about when he's talking about the abuelas and the taxi drivers and the kind of various coalitions of unhyphenated Americans. Right. He's talking about a third worldist liberation of New York City against the domination, not just of the old, WASP or Dutch, settler communities, but against the 20th century, white ethnics, what are now assimilated into whiteness as one group. And that's what he's doing. I mean, he said even at some point, we need to tax white neighborhoods and redistribute the wealth to the newly arrived, brown and black immigrants. And if you look at the voting patterns, this message is not just appealing to those kind of ethnic groups that he's directly mobilizing, but they're very appealing to younger voters, to recent transplants to New York City, to kind of religious voters or atheistic voters, and they're very appealing to female voters. And so that is a politics that works, and it works not just by mobilizing along demographic lines, but by kind of getting into the majority demographic of the United States, writ large, through those ideological points that, again, third worldist liberation was like a very chic fantasy for white leftists in the United States in the 1960s. And we're seeing that dynamic play out again today.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Like, I think you're identifying here, like, the DSA contingent, the sort of like Chapo Trap House contingent. These are like highly educated, but nonetheless downwardly mobile, like whites who are glomming on to this kind of, liberationist ideology because it's sort of interesting, it's novel, but it also sort of exercises some of their kind of internal resentments against a culture, against a society that has, in some ways sort of like let them down. They have nowhere to go. Their prospects are not great. And so it's not terribly surprising that they've gone along for the ride here. And what Mamdani does is it gives this politics the kind of imprimatur of the other, which is something they fetishize. So like, had this just been a generic like DSA white guy, it's not as interesting. It's not as authentic. So Mamdani gives it this sort of like special credibility and legitimacy that, they can't get for themselves. And I want to add here, like, the other, like the kind of disappointing thing about this is, again, we talked about this at the top of this segment, but the Republican response has been so off key and kind of tone deaf. And I saw Mike Johnson today, for example, like whinging about, New York electing this Islamist, anti-Semitic mayor. But that's like, that's
totally
like
missing
probably
the
not
point.
even true, and it's
totally missing the point.
Beside the point. And part of the problem here, and I just like this is going to get into other stuff we're going to talk about today, but Mike Johnson can't just say that this guy is sort of like anti-white and is opposed to white interests, and so like this other angle allows him to kind of nudge and gesture at some of that, but without saying it outright. And I think at some point the Republican Party is just going to have to like, get some spine and just call reality what it is in talking about people like Mamdani. So, okay, that's New York. Do we have anything else to say about New York? Do we want to cover like New Jersey, Virginia?
I mean, New Jersey and Virginia, in my mind, are like two places that just blend into one another, right?
Yeah.
New Jersey, of course, is like the kind of provincial attachment to New York City. Virginia is the provincial attachment to Washington, D.C. And so these are just like the suburban Acela corridor. And is it surprising that the suburban Acela corridor elected like kind of plausible but like latently psychotic Democrats, one of whom was like, "We're going to murder your children because we hate Republicans so much"? No, that doesn't surprise me, and I'm not sure it really merits much comment beyond the fact that Democrats stick together. Democrats are able to kind of transcend scandal, transcend violent rhetoric, transcend disqualifying events, what should be disqualifying events.
Yeah.
Because they have the machine they have the discipline, they have the media narratives, and Republicans have not been able to figure out how to overcome the machine politics of Democrats. And then, again, at the simplest level, what is already a baked-in voter registration majority in those kind of Acela states.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, as I do for any election sort of analysis, I go to the country's premier, election pundit, Jeremy Carl. So I was reading Jeremy Carl's notes about this. Good friend of the show, Jeremy Carl. He pointed out that the closest comp we have to this situation is 2017, another off year after Trump had won. Everything was kind of in limbo, and the economy was kind of flagging a little bit. It was a little unclear where that first Trump admin was going to go. And both in Virginia, there was something like a 10-point win for the race there. And in New Jersey, it was a 14-point win. This year, Virginia has gone 15, so that's been an improvement, whereas New Jersey basically 13, so that's more or less the same. So we're kind of par for the course. It's not great. Of course, you'd like to see some improvement. I don't know that there's much to be gained from reading any tea leaves here, other than, of course, Virginia, you have a lot of government workers. And if Trump has done nothing else, he's put a lot of jobs, these government jobs, in jeopardy. I think the shutdown might be hurting him there a little bit. I think some of the Doge stuff, but okay, is that a cost we're willing to pay, losing some sort of marginal voters in Northern Virginia so that we can actually do something to reform our federal bureaucracies? Absolutely, yes. Okay, we lost the election, move on. That doesn't mean we need to rethink the entire strategy here. I'm not trying to over-index the importance of this. There's one last election thing I want to point out. This interesting sort of prop in Texas that would allow these tax exemptions for boomers. Did you see this? If you're over the age of 60, okay, you get additional tax exemptions. This is something that California has. California has a property tax law that locks in your property tax value from the time you purchase your home. So you have a lot of these older Californians sitting on property that they bought in the 1970s, paying property taxes based on 1970s valuations, while the rest of the state and any new home buyers have to pay, orders of magnitude above that, which it comes at a severe price for younger home buyers, younger people in general. So, okay, is this important? Or how important is this? Boomers, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Can you please just not be selfish for 5 minutes challenge? What do we do about this?
Well, it's so frustrating. And I think it's just another indicator that the GOP establishment remains a brain dead establishment. And they're operating on a political framework that hasn't changed since the 1980s. And in this case, in California, tax rates that haven't changed since the 1980s.
It's incredible.
And it's bad for the country. And I think it's bad for young people. And in this sense, and it ties in with Mamdani's pitch, which is about affordability. And Mamdani's pitch is young people can't afford to live, can't afford to dream. And while that is the most dystopian, Orwellian, kind of vaguely, Soviet tier sloganeering that he's not going to deliver on,
right.
The general sense of frustration that he's tapping into is correct. Because let's say you're a 25-year-old kid, you're looking at buying a house. Well, home prices in a lot of places have doubled since 2020, tripled since 2015. Interest rates are now pushing, 7-8%, depending on your credit score and whatnot. And you're looking at this kind of impossible situation. And then at the same time, boomers who own their home outright are getting a tax break on their property tax. It's what are we doing? We're basically just catering our society towards boomers. And in one sense, look, boomers vote, although their share of the vote will decline over time. And so in one sense, it's just simple kind of transactional politics. But what you need is a conservative response that taps in to a broader demographic. I think Trump did a really good job during the 2024 election, broadening the racial demographics, broadening the age demographics. You know, young men were in his corner, Latinos, especially Latino men were in his corner. He had great inroads with black men. Just like do that. And a lot of the establishment on our side is just resistant to figure out what works for Trump. And they, at their peril, they dismiss Trump as a purely kind of personality phenomenon. And I think this actually segues in nicely to the next story. Like, as all of these things are happening, the right is running around, you know, with its hair on fire. And we are like now a full week or more than a week into like Fuentes Gate or Groyper Gate, this like idiotic scandal where everyone on our side is not just taking the bait, but like just eating the bait so passionately and not even realizing that they've been hooked.
But here we are talking about it.
Break, you know? And here we are talking about we're taking the bait. We're taking the bait. We're maintaining strategic distance and an emotional coldness with this bait. We're looking at the bait. We're analyzing the bait. We are kind of deconstructing the bait, but we're not taking the bait. But for those of the people who are blessedly ignorant about what's happening, give us the basic rundown of this scandal in kind of the least inside baseball manner that you can.
I mean, it's kind of even hard to describe because, you know, we were talking about like, we're in an age, we're in a period of like just pure psychodrama. So these are, you know, streamer wars, pundit wars. I think there might be something like maybe significant sort of at the core of this. And we'll try to drill down and like figure out what is actually animating a lot of this. But the kind of burn off we're seeing is just, you know, psychodrama mostly. Okay, the short of it is there's a streamer, Nick Fuentes, young guy. He is sort of nominally on the right. However, he like sort of opposed Donald Trump and wanted to get his supporters to vote for Kamala. And, you know, he wanted to make Kanye president. And he, you know, he's been critical of J.D. Vance, critical of the Israel lobby in particular. And, you know, he talks about the JQ, the Jewish question, et cetera. And this has provoked a lot of consternation and sort of like emotional reaction from the conservative commentariat. And so, okay, so there's this guy and he's got this stream and he's got these followers called Groypers. And then Tucker Carlson, everybody knows Tucker Carlson, a man who needs no introduction, had Fuentes on his show. Okay, so Tucker Carlson has this big platform. He has Fuentes on this show. And now there's been this like weeks long back and forth debate about the, you know, prudence of having Nick Fuentes on your show and whether this constitutes some kind of like betrayal of the movement. And does Tucker Carlson now have a seat at the table? What seat? Nobody really knows. Nobody will specify what any of this stuff means. It all just sort of lives in this abstract space, the kind of vague sort of emotional discourse that gets passed around on Twitter. And nonetheless, this has now created real world consequences. So the Heritage Foundation has been embroiled in this scandal. Kevin Roberts put out a video sort of explaining, I mean, maybe not in the most artful way, his position on this, which caused more backlash. And now people are threatening to, you know, maybe take funds from the Heritage Foundation. And then, okay, the turn here is that the New York Times and sort of the liberal establishment has caught wind of this phenomenon and this wedge that now exists within the right to try to sort of further inflame these differences, not just of opinions, but sort of different ideological strains that Trump is holding together as a part of this coalition. And I do think there are real differences here and real sort of potential for this thing to fracture. So again, I don't want to be so dismissive as to say none of this matters. But what we've seen is the New York Times, people who don't like Trump, who've never liked Trump, who want to see the MAGA coalition fail, who want to see the return to a kind of centrist, you know, sort of liberal conservatism. they want to use this as a wedge to break apart the MAGA coalition. And here we are trying to make some sense of this. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think the one thing that you missed is that, like all great, highly intellectual debates in the United States, it really boils down to Hitler. And so, like, we have
okay, true.
We've gone now, you're full Hitler in this debate. Like Hitler is like the great kind of central symbol of our times, and everything is reduced to this kind of surface level kind of morality where everyone accuses everyone else of being a Nazi. And Fuentes's appeal and Fuentes's rise to fame comes along with his oftentimes explicit endorsement of Hitler, of Nazism. And let's roll a clip to show people exactly what this looks like and then analyze it.
Hitler was a pedophile and kind of a pagan. It's like, well, he was also really cool. So, time to grow up. We're not children anymore. Am I right? Am I right? Am I right, boys? Am I right? Let's go. He was also really cool. And any boy knows that. Anybody that watches these videos where he's rolling down the street and stuff, it's like, this guy's awesome. This guy's cool.
And so here's how I think about it, and here's how I try to maintain that kind of cold, calculating, strategic analysis of this phenomenon. What I don't want to do is take the bait and react emotionally. And what I think a better frame of reference is to look at it as far as actions, outcomes, interests. And so you can see why the left is interested in this clip. Or this kind of general phenomenon, because the left has been trying to turn, the conservatives into Nazis and Trump into Hitler for 10 years now. That's been like the dominant rhetorical arc that they've been trying to build. They failed to do it in Trump's first term. They've failed to do it in this recent reelection campaign. And just as that kind of great liberal hope of establishing the narrative has fizzled out, they get someone who's willing to kind of break the taboo and openly say, look at Hitler. Hitler is great. Hitler is so cool. And so the establishment left press, the New York Times, finally got their Nazi. And of course, this is in Fuentes' interest because these clips become highly viral, right? They're scandalous, they're salacious, they're shocking, they're kind of digestible as sound bites. They circulate through television, through podcasts, through other digital platforms. But what the right has done now is also buy into this. You have Ted Cruz saying, look at this complete Nazi. You have conservative think tank staffers saying Nazis are bad, and look, on one level, that's obviously true, right? Historical Nazism was awful. It was monstrous. It was a disaster. But they're falling for, what postmodern theorists called hyper-reality. There's reality, the world as it is, social connections, material connections, kind of really meaningful things in the world. Then there's hyper-reality. These are simulations or digital representations or zeros and ones that simulate some past reality, but they don't actually have the embodied force or kind of real social or historical weight of those past events. And so I like to say that, Nick Fuentes is not a Nazi, because the Nazis, Germany was denazified in the 1940s, and besides pockets of, skinheads or neo-Nazis in Europe and elsewhere, Nazism is a long dead ideology. And instead, he's using the symbols of Nazism to drive controversy and then to increase his kind of attention and notoriety, to play the villain in the left, to play the spoiler on the right. And if you take that framework, you say, this is like Nazism in the hyper-real sense only. We're not going to react emotionally or hysterically to it. And then you analyze the actual outcomes, say, well, he tried to spoil Trump. It didn't work. There aren't actually Groyper voters out there. It's a digital phenomenon. And then if you look at, what he's doing on the right practically, pragmatically. He's signaling against Trump, signaling against Vance, splitting the conservative coalition. You can kind of generate your opinion about it, just setting like the moral hysteria aside, setting the kind of moral questions aside altogether for now. They're important, but I think they're easily kind of manipulated. You simply have to say, when Fuentes' notoriety rises, the right's power, coherence, and political fortune declines, and so adjust accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, you spelled this out in this essay you just wrote for City Journal, which I had a chance to read, and I think the thesis is basically right. I mean, I'm not going to quibble like too much on the margins. I think, just even like showing that clip or like talking about Hitler, like using that language is already losing the fight. It's already like capitulating that this is like commentary worth engaging in. I think most young people see that clip of him and they just laugh. That's it. It's just this kind of like mild amusement. And okay, fine. That's totally fine. Like that's like okay. I want to like, all right, let me because we talk about what are the policy implications of any of this? Like, how does this cash out into politics? What are the consequences, as you say? Even on like, if you take this core position, and I don't want to dismiss that there's nothing going on. It's not just sort of randomized sort of politics. There is a core to this, and it's a mistake to avoid what the core issue is. And of course, it revolves around Israel. It revolves around this kind of like relationship with Israel that the United States has vis-a-vis foreign policy, vis-a-vis a kind of moral commitment and diplomatic commitment to this country. This quote unquote special relationship. What is the basis of that special relationship? Can we actually talk about it? And when you actually, what's interesting, like when you listen to Fuentes, for example, I saw this clip going around where he was talking about how actually he sort of supports the U.S. giving money to Israel. So even on like the central question, should we be funding Israel? He sort of came around to this position that yes, we should, because that's the only way to control Israel. And this was based on some tablet article that Jacob Siegel had written. And there are like Israel boosters who want a withdrawal of sort of explicit diplomatic and materiel support so that Israel has more freedom to do what they want with their neighbors. And so Fuentes was like, well, maybe we actually do want to sort of like maintain some control, which demonstrates a sort of like nimble thinking and gets to the heart of this, which is actually it's sort of complicated. But the operating question is, we need to ask first, what is in America's interest here? And like when we're talking about Israel, it needs to be treated. There is no, in response to this whole like episode, I saw this yesterday. Some task force that the Heritage put together this statement, sort of making this, in my view, this very sort of like histrionic demand of what the Heritage Foundation needs to do in response to this controversy. And embedded in that demand is this sentence to preserve the role of Israel and its special biblical and political arrangement with the United States. And I think that's wrong, okay? Like, I do think that's a mistake to think that Israel has some special role. Israel ought to be treated like any other country. It ought to be treated like Paraguay or like Slovenia or Singapore, which is to say that our interests come first. When we are evaluating how we want to interact with Israel, that is the only thing that matters. And so what this, and we can like have that debate. Maybe it does make sense, for example, to give them money. Maybe it doesn't. I think this administration is sort of like walking a fine line and has done a pretty good job. And I certainly think like the Israel lobby, maybe they got 80% of what they wanted out of this. That's good enough, and they should be happy with that. But I think we need to actually address like what it is that is at the core of this, and
Sure.
what Fuentes's followers, the people who listen to these clips, they see a old foreign policy establishment that seems to have a special interest with Israel. They see things like these anti-Semitic hate laws, these special carve-outs. They've been told for a long time that Israel is our greatest ally. This has kind of just been a default view. And they want that to be addressed. And I think we would be mistaken to just dismiss this whole thing purely as spectacle without sort of taking some of those concerns seriously.
Sure. And it's interesting. So let's talk about it. And look, I think that there is a good case to be made. Unfortunately, I think the kind of pro-Israel partisans have not made the case, and they've actually made some serious kind of strategic blunders in how they're going about it. I mean, the case for the relationship with Israel is twofold. There's a geopolitical case, and I think there is a kind of biblical, religious, or spiritual case. And there's a reason that Israel is different than Paraguay, right? It's the birthplace and a kind of the most important site for the Abrahamic faiths, and in particular in the United States, in context for Christianity. And so I think that there's an immense interest, and it's a kind of axiomatic if you just ask yourself, is it better to have the Christian holy sites under the care and protection of Israel, or would it be better, in kind of thinking theoretically, if they were under the care of Hamas? And the answer is strikingly obvious. And so I think that there is a special interest that can be explained. The problem is that conservative GOP, congressmen who go on these group trips to Israel have this crazy theory that I don't even fully understand. I think it's some evangelical Protestant theory that revelation is coming, and the wars in Israel are these biblical signs that the end is near, and we have to get ready for the rapture or whatever. And again, I don't even fully understand it, but it's crazy. It sounds nuts, and I think it's so unpersuasive to people, and that it's not a good argument for anybody. And then kind of gives ammunition to the side that is saying, that these congressmen are kind of out to lunch with this stuff. I think a simple interest, the preservation of the holy sites, the kind of the religious and spiritual birthplace, is actually a very good argument, and it's simultaneously a religious argument, but it's also a practical argument about historical preservation. For the same reason, I think the British Museum is very important. I think world artifacts are better kept in the British Museum than by the Taliban in Afghanistan. The second argument is a geopolitical argument. And again, I think that the kind of reaction that we've seen, even from some on the right, is we need the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. We need special protections for Jewish American students on campus. And it's so frustrating to me, and I've argued against these initiatives this whole time, because, hey, wait a minute, just as we've kind of entrenched the argument against DEI, just as the Trump administration conservatives have been on the anti-DEI campaign for years, finally yielding success, we're creating something that looks, surprisingly like a program that has special designation for a single ethno-religious group, or perhaps infringes in a kind of complex civil rights bureaucratic way, infringes on speech or expands hate speech provisions in the interest of a single group. I think that this is such a huge mistake. I think it's a huge mistake on principle. I think it's also a huge mistake, again, setting principle aside, it's a huge mistake tactically, because it doesn't solve the problem. I think it kind of transgresses what should be our core principles, and it gives ammunition to the other side, saying, "Look, these are special carve-outs, for this group over all other groups." We've seen it in Texas, we've seen it in Florida, we've seen it on the national stage. Whereas I think the answer to a lot of these questions, and if you want to even talk about geopolitically, we actually have an interest in the Middle East. The Middle East, although we would all wish that it wouldn't be this way, is a strategically important region. It's a very volatile region. And the people who call Israel the little Satan, call us the big Satan. And so there are some aligned interests that are perceived on both sides. What I haven't heard from our political leaders, however, is a clear, concise, and sustained argument. Why is it in our interest to send, X billion dollars every year to Israel? What are we getting out of this partnership? Why is it important for our own interests to continue the relationship or to deepen the relationship? I think there's a good argument, but unfortunately, I think it's lost, not just from critics, but if we're going to be, very honest about it, it's lost even by the partisans. And I think the partisans are defaulting to, speech regulations, to kind of DEI style programs, to deplatforming. And look, the reality is that was the playbook of the ADL, which is a kind of left-wing political organization. And that playbook should be opposed, whether it's from the ADL, the SPLC, any other group. That's not how we win. That's not what we should be pursuing. And although I support the general cause, I think a kind of strategic shift needs to be put in place.
Yeah. And one other aspect to this that I think is important given that context and the need for a more robust debate on this subject is I just want to say about Tucker Carlson, this guy has done more probably to shepherd the Trump sort of era out of the grasp of the pre-Trump GOP than just about anybody else. And he gets more or less as much latitude as he wants to interview whoever he wants on his show. And I can just tell you, we've already started this show. I've already started thinking about the kinds of guests we might want to have on. I do not want to be told who we can and can't have on, as if there is some board out there, some panel that gets to make judgments about who you're allowed to have on your podcast and what kinds of conversations you have with them, whether you have to be adversarial or more friendly or anything else. Tucker can have on Larry Sinclair. He can have on whoever he wants, and he can talk about whoever he wants. He's earned it, okay? He's earned the right. Secondly, as a tactical matter, you are going to lose this fight, even if you disagree with Tucker. You cannot win in a coalition that doesn't consist of Tucker and Tucker's audience. It is just dumb as a tactical matter. You have to allow people like Tucker to voice whatever criticisms, and even if you think it's misplaced, and even if you think some of it might not be in good faith, okay, that's fine. You don't cancel this guy, okay? He's got millions. What are you going to do? First of all, you're going to cancel Tucker Carlson? You're going to get the Tucker Carlson network to somehow take his show off the air? Is that how you think this is going to go? His millions of followers on YouTube, his advertisers are just going to disappear? That's not going to happen. Okay, that's not going to happen. So you need to learn to sort of accommodate this kind of dissent. And moreover, there are other people who I think are, like Kurt Mills, the American conservative. I was at a conference where he was speaking. I don't even know, do I agree or not? Maybe some things he's saying are interesting. I think it's worth hearing. These things are worth hearing. They're worth engaging with. Someone like John Mearsheimer, these people are worth engaging in. You have to engage with these people. You have to listen to these counter arguments. And guess what? They might be right about something. Okay, they might be right about something. So I just want to sort of say that this coalition is going to be inclusive of people who have highly divergent sort of foreign policy views, especially as it applies to Israel, but elsewhere as well. And that's okay. We can live inside the same tent. I think we have to live inside the same tent. There's nowhere else for us to go. So I just want to, bracket that as one piece of this, that, this coalition is bigger than any one interest. It is bigger than any one even domain of sort of policy. I would rather us not be so foreign policy obsessed anyway. I would say to American Jews who are maybe genuinely concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism or something, all you have to do is be MAGA, okay? MAGA is good for you. Just advocate for the interests of yourself as Americans. And that other stuff just comes along for the ride. But I think as with any professional activist class who is speaking on behalf of a minority. And, you know, I hear this all the time. Like, I remember Li Fang, I think it was Li Fang, talking about this in terms of like Asian activists. You have a professional class of activists who speak from the position of their ethnic interests first. And it muddies any like meaningful conversation that those people can have about their interests as Americans first. And so MAGA is good. Just follow along, support MAGA candidates, and everything else comes along for the ride.
Yeah, and I think, look, there's 2 points that immediately come to mind for me. One is this question of, you know, the right is I think so eager, and we've seen it, to kind of and look, some selection, some curation, some thought, some taste, right? Like, we're going to have different guests on than another show because we have different ideas, different preferences, different interests, different curiosity. But I think we do need to have, while we should distinguish between kind of dead ends that are bad for the movement, I think like Groyperism, I would put in that category. We should have a kind of platforms for wider debate. And my test is always this. You know, I read a book about Herbert Marcuse and Angela Davis and Paulo Freire and the critical race theorists. You know, I took their ideas seriously. I didn't treat them as if like they're so outrageous, so disgusting, so off-putting, so beyond the pale that I'm gonna, you know, have kind of an emotional fit about it. It's like, no, I'm a grown adult. I'm an intellectually curious person. I'm gonna actually learn about these people, try to give them even people on the left said, wow, your profiles of these people in this book, these biographical sketches were like interesting to me. And I was looking for this kind of venomous tone of denunciation. But it's like, that's not a way to conduct ourselves. And I don't think ultimately it's very attractive. And so I think that the best way is to have these debates, to disarm people, and to have, you know, permit a wider variety. Like you and I know, I've had debates with Curtis Yarvin, you know, who I don't agree with at all on anything. But there is something that you learn from those debates, something that you gain. You strengthen your arguments. You see where your arguments might be weaker. You learn about someone else's arguments. And I think that we need to have a set of boundaries that permits debate, but is also sophisticated in kind of sorting out the real from the hyper real, the dead ends from the, you know, productive possibilities. And if we're talking about foreign policy, like my ideal amount of time thinking about foreign policy is like less than 5% of my time. Yeah. Like the less I'm thinking about foreign policy, the better. And two things happened this week that I think are important and related. You know, one is the death of Dick Cheney, who was like the kind of architect of America's interventionist foreign policy over the last, you know, 25 years, or longer, actually, if you go way back. And to me, it's like the answer is simple. Dick Cheney's politics was terrible for the country. Donald Trump's foreign policy has been like pitch perfect, 10 out of 10. And so we're having these debates right now. And I think, once again, the answer is very simple. Dick Cheney, George Bush, the kind of Republican kind of hawk policies of the last 25 years, total disaster. Donald Trump, like 10 out of 10. You know, he knows when to negotiate. He knows when to flatter. He knows when to use force. And he knows how to advance America's interests without getting trapped in these endless wars. Like, why are we debating this? Everyone should just agree. Trump, foreign policy, perfect. Let's take it and let's go from there.
Yeah, Dick Cheney dying. I mean, that is like kind of a perfect segue. In many ways, he is the kind of avatar for the sort of foreign policy establishment that we are finally graduating out of. Of course, he wasn't the only one. This is, you know, basically from the Cold War forward, you had a foreign policy that was dominated by the neoconservatives, dominated by a ambition, what they felt was a kind of obligation, and what they called the unipolar moment. Okay, there was no China, or China was not a sort of global force. You have the Soviet Union, which is in this period of like quasi reinvigoration, but really wasn't going to be able to sort of impose itself in any meaningful way on global matters. You have a Europe that basically just became an appendage of the United States. And so you had a foreign policy establishment that used this opportunity to try to export, almost in a sort of a proselytizing fashion, this sort of liberal democratic project throughout the world, completely ignorant or neglectful, I should say. I mean, whether they understood or not what was going on around the world, they were certainly neglectful of all the different peculiarities and sort of historical contingencies and population idiosyncrasies in these various countries, and whether it would even be possible to have something like a liberal democracy in these places. But they were stuck in this Cold War mindset, where they saw the entire world as sort of the chessboard for their maneuvering. And Dick Cheney sort of carried this attitude forward into the disasters, the absolute disasters of the Iraq War and what happened after 9/11. And I think maybe more than anything, what gave shape not just to the Trump moment, but all these other sort of political spasms that we're experiencing right now, was that disaster that happened at the end of the 90s and into the early 2000s, where what we could have done in this period of total global hegemony, total global dominance, was to actually retreat in some sense. There's this great foreign policy advocate who worked under Reagan, of all people, and she actually was a neoconservative, Jeanne Kirkpatrick, who after the Cold War wrote this great article, A Normal Country for a Normal Time. And it was like, look, the Cold War's over now. We can now retreat back to our interests as Americans, and start putting money and resources into local manufacturing and sort of rebuild a middle class that was starting to sort of get hollowed out as globalization was coming on board. But instead we went the opposite direction, which was part economic. Okay, it was part sort of NAFTA and moving all these jobs overseas, part outsourcing. And we can argue about the sort of consequences of that. But certainly one of the consequences was a kind of alienation that set in. There was a certain loss of sort of cultural coherence, identity. There was a kind of, this atomization that happened in a lot of these towns that were hollowed out. And then in conjunction with that, you have a foreign policy that wants to expend more and more of these resources. And of course, the soldiers that would fight these wars are the very people who would come from these hollowed out places. Dick Cheney, of course, was central to this as, the vice president under George Bush. And I think we have to remember right now, as we sit here and kind of negotiate over what comes next for the right, how far we've come. Okay, we've left that behind. I think there is, if nothing else, this consensus that was the wrong path, that those were massive, catastrophic mistakes for our country, for the people of our country, and really for the world as a whole. Very little good came out of that kind of posture. And so we've moved on from that. Trump represents, I think, in some sense, a bridge. He is guiding us forward to the other side of this gulf. But there's still some question of, okay, how does this settle out on the other side? I think we're figuring that out now. But I think Dick Cheney's death, and I don't celebrate death, R.I.P. Dick Cheney. However, I think it represents a kind of final end state, maybe some final severance from that particular worldview.
Yeah. Obviously, we don't celebrate, and condolences to the Cheney family. But I think I'm more skeptical, actually. Like, I think that worldview does not, get buried alongside Dick Cheney. And in fact, has the possibility of coming back. And you still have Lindsey Graham, you still have Nikki Haley, you still have a more kind of interventionist part of the conservative establishment. And so, like, I think my cynical take and my disappointed and frustrated take on the debates of this last week or two is that it's like totally unnecessary, circular firing squad, doesn't actually elucidate the issues. It brings to the center stage people who are totally counterproductive for the movement as a whole. But if we're going to try to put an optimistic gloss on things, what could happen and look, should happen is over the next year, the next 2 or 3 years, especially as we get into the next presidential campaign and particularly the Republican primaries, we should have a debate internally on the direction of foreign policy. And my sincere hope is that the Trumpist foreign policy wins. And look, it's also not lost on me that these things flip. You have, everyone from Bill Kristol to the Cheney family to George Bush, kind of on Team Kamala, against
Bill
Trump.
Kristol.
And so,
Bill Kristol endorsed Mamdani. Okay.
That's right.
This is how, I think it was Kristol endorsed Mamdani. This is how far we've fallen. Okay. Like these people are just now libs, right?
That is like the circular firing squad thesis though. So, right. It's like
unbelievable.
We've become so deranged by these kind of flashing symbols on the timeline and kind of ideological currents and financial flows, right? Where does Bill Kristol's, where does his bread get buttered these days from the left? That like you have these like completely strange bedfellows. And the other thing that, to bring it full circle is a lot of these foreign conflicts that were a disaster overseas, we've also now imported into the United States, which is just like the most catastrophic part and could have been totally avoided. The United States was not a colonial power in the same way that the Europeans were colonial powers overseas, right? And so we could have avoided it. Europe didn't avoid it. We haven't avoided it. And so, the longer I get through it, it's like, man, Trump really saw this stuff coming. He made the gutsy calls in 2015, 2016, and he's been really proven right. And I'll give you the last word.
Trump's proven right. Okay, that's as good of a last word as I could possibly come up with. Okay, as the resident Trump sycophant, Trump is right. If Trump says go, we go. Okay, if Trump says stop, we stop.